What's up everybody? Nate here. So the brand new inflation numbers are in, and guess what? Inflation hit a new over 40-year high back in March of 2022. Inflation now sits at around 8.5%. That's the highest that we've seen since 1981. And inflation has been rising since about the mid to late parts of 2020. And we've been tracking inflation every single month on this channel, but this new inflation report actually showed that inflation might be hitting its peak in 2022. Even though inflation has been going up, meaning the cost of everything in our economy has been rising over the last 2 years, there actually were a few small bright spots in this brand new CPI report. And today we're going to be talking about all of those. I'm going to walk you through everything that went up in price in March of 2022 and some things that went down, and then we're going to go over what all of this actually means for our economy and our country. But before I get into all of that, do me a quick favor and hit smash or destroy that thumbs up button below and ring that notification bell too. Both of those two things are completely free and they help to show me that you like this video and that you want to see even more just like it. Thank you so much for doing that. And now let's talk all about inflation, what happened on this last report, and what could be coming in the future. All right, so to go over some of the numbers here, inflation is now 8.5% in the United States. Now, just to be clear, it didn't go up by 8.5% month over month. That is year over year. So this time last year, inflation was 8.5% less. But inflation went up by around 0.6%, and it's been going up at about that same rate every single month in the United States. Now, each and every one of us are familiar with inflation. Even if you're not familiar with the term inflation, you've definitely been feeling it in your lives for the past few years now. Inflation simply means that the monetary supply of a country is going up. So the United States government is printing a lot more money than usual. And we've definitely seen this over the last 2 years. In 2020 and in 2021, the United States government printed trillions of dollars in stimulus. And now today, that is directly contributing to inflation. You see, when the United States government prints a lot more money, they give that money back to American citizens. American citizens and consumers can then go out and spend it however they want to. And they definitely did that in 2020 and in 2021 as we saw supply and demand kind of get way off balance. We ran into supply chain issues and are still facing a lot of those today, which are directly contributing to the price of everything going up because businesses now have to produce a lot more goods. They don't have the same amount of supply and demand is steadily starting to rise. Now, of course, over the last few months, demand has pretty much leveled out, but the supply of everything is getting a lot worse for a lot of companies. Not only that, but they don't have enough workers to produce goods, so the prices are going up. And the way that we measure inflation every single month is through something called the Consumer Price Index. The CPI report comes out every single month, and it shows how the average price of everything is increasing in the United States. Of course, it's also going to show you how individual sectors are going up as well, such as food and auto sales and shelter costs. But the inflation that we're experiencing in that 8.5% number is the average of everything in our economy going up. Now, there is actually another number that experts and the Federal Reserve like to look at when they measure inflation. That number is called core CPI, and instead of taking everything in our economy, they exclude things like food and energy costs from our overall inflation number. Core CPI is now around 6.5% in the United States, but here is kind of the silver lining of that number. Core inflation only went up by around 0.3%, which is way lower than the Dow Jones was estimating. They thought it was actually going to go up by 0.5%. So core inflation coming down a little bit is leading some investors and experts to believe that inflation might be at its peak in the United States. Now, what were the individual numbers? What exactly is rising the fastest and the most in the United States right now? Well, food costs in March went up by around 1%, and they're now up by over 8.8% year over year. Energy prices increased by around 11% in March of 2022 alone and have now increased by 32% year over year. And that also includes gasoline prices, which went up by 18% in March and are now almost up over 50% year over year. But like I said at the beginning of this video, not everything went up on the latest Consumer Price Index report. We actually saw used car prices decreasing in March of 2022. Used car prices went down by around 3.8% for the month. Now, they're still up by around 35% year over year, but they're starting to show some signs that the they're coming back. Commodity prices also went down by around 0.4%. So there are some things that are starting to go down, and that is all contributing to the lower core inflation numbers that we talked about earlier. But for the most part, prices in the United States are continuing to rise. So what exactly is going on here? Is there anything that the federal government and our businesses can do about inflation, or are we just going to be facing these super high prices forever? Well, there are some things that can be done about inflation. The first all comes from the Federal Reserve. It's their job to set monetary policy in the United States and keep a super close eye on inflation. It's important to note here that inflation is something that our economy has been facing for a very, very long time. Typically though, inflation is only around the 1 to 3% mark. This is what the Federal Reserve considers healthy inflation. To a certain degree, the Federal Reserve and our United States economy needs some level of inflation because they have to print money in order for our economy to grow. I mean, you got to think about it. When you print money, the federal government doesn't just sit on it. They then send that money out to the masses so that it can be spent and businesses can start to grow. There was a big fear that that growing in our economy wasn't going to happen in 2020. That's why the Federal Reserve and the United States government stepped in and provided trillions of dollars in stimulus. Like I said before though, that created a lot of demand, which led to supply chain issues, and now we're kind of facing all of the effects of that today. Every single time you spend money, the value of it is going down because there's just so much money in our economy. So the first step is for the Federal Reserve to remove that demand. So that means cutting off economic stimulus and raising their benchmark interest rates. That's kind of the two key functions of the Federal Reserve. They can print a lot of money and they control the benchmark interest rates in the United States. That kind of helps to understand how easy it is for banks and financial institutions to get their money so they can lend out more of it. They drop their interest rates to 0% in 2020 because they wanted to spark a lot of demand. They wanted Americans to go out and spend a lot of money, so they made it easy to get a mortgage and an auto loan. That directly contributed to the housing market exploding because now you had millions of Americans who before could not afford a home because interest rates were so high, but now they could get into a home and relatively cheaply. Obviously, things have changed a lot since then, especially with the housing market, as housing prices have gone way up, as demand has rose, and housing inventory has basically crashed. But as of March 2022, the Federal Reserve has started to raise its benchmark interest rates. Immediately, it raised its interest rates by around 0.25% or 25 basis points. Now, depending on which direction inflation takes in the future, the Federal Reserve has talked about doing a 50 basis point hike or a 0.5% hike. That would mean inflation goes from 0% all the way up to almost 1% in just the span of a few months. That makes it a lot harder for people to go out and get a loan because now if you could afford a mortgage at a really low interest rate, well, you can't afford it anymore if interest rates are going way up. I mean, we're talking hundreds of extra dollars every single month, and with everything else costing so much right now, Americans just don't have that cash. As of about mid-April 2022, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate was around 5% in the United States. That is much higher considering when I bought my first home all the way back at the beginning of 2020, interest rates were very low, right around 3 and even 2%. So they nearly doubled, which means people are now going to be spending a lot more if they want to get a mortgage. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't want to tank our economy and cause a recession by raising interest rates way too quickly and way too aggressively. They want people to go out and spend money still, but they don't want everybody to be able to do so. It's gonna kind of limit our economy a little bit because the people who have money are still gonna be able to go out and spend, but the people who don't have as much money aren't gonna be able to really buy anything. They're only gonna be able to buy their necessities. They're not gonna be able to go out and buy all of the things that they want. And of course, the Federal Reserve can pull a lot of its stimulus from Wall Street. Now, part of its program set in 2020 was pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into the New York Stock Exchange. They started buying corporate bonds and treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities every single month. They racked up a balance sheet of around $9 trillion, pouring tons of extra liquidity into the stock market. That meant that asset prices were going to go even higher because now investors could trade with Uncle Sam's money and not their own. They could get super risky and take bets because if they failed, well, then they didn't lose any of their own money. The Fed wants to pull all of that stimulus too, so So in 2022, they're now running off their balance sheet, which means less money going into banks and financial institutions for loans, making interest rates go even higher. So that kind of eliminates all of the demand in our economy. The other thing we can do is on the business end. Businesses can start paying employees a lot more to meet up with inflation. For instance, I'm sure you've heard of the 2 to 3% raise that some employers give every single year. Well, the reason they give a 2 to 3% raise is not out of the goodness of their own heart. The reason they give out that raise at that specific amount is because that's what inflation usually is. They want their employees to be able to spend money, and if every single year their employees are losing money, well then they're all going to quit. So employers give out raises, but they don't give out really any sort of significant raise. It's just enough to meet inflation. The cost of things increases every year pretty much naturally as the Federal Reserve prints more money. Things have gotten crazy over the last 2 years though. The Federal Reserve has printed so much money that businesses now have to increase wages way faster than they're used to. Year over year, wages have now increased by 5.6%, but seasonally adjusted wages actually declined by 0.8%. I mean, if wages only went up by 5.6% and inflation is 8.5%, then workers are losing a lot of money, which means they're not able to buy all of the same things they could anymore, which means profits are going to be a lot less for companies because people are not going to be able to afford all of their goods and services because they're increasing prices, but people are not making enough money. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve keeps a very close eye on employment. They want something called maximum employment in our country. So basically anybody that is able to work is working in our country. If they can do that in theory, then everybody is getting a paycheck so everybody can buy things. After a while, wages should only meet inflation. So if everybody stays employed, then we really don't have any major issues. But you know, and I know that the United States is never going to reach maximum employment, and the Federal Reserve actually prefers the US to have some type of unemployment. Because the fact of the matter is the more money that businesses have to pay people, the more people can spend and inflation goes up. They don't want to see inflation get out of control, so the Fed actually prefers to have a slight amount of unemployment in your economy, usually around 3 to 4%. Now, what exactly is coming next for inflation in our economy? Well, it is a good sign that core inflation is starting to slow down a little bit, but you got to remember this is just 1 month and it still actually increased a lot in March of 2022. It's nice to see that used car prices are going down because they have been insane over the last 2 years or so. I mean, used cars were actually gaining value for the first time in a long time. They usually lose value, but because it was difficult to buy a new vehicle, people turned to used cars and then the demand spiked. Additionally, there has been a lot of talk about a recession in the United States. Now, a recession means that we have 2 quarters of economic shrinking in our country. Economic shrinking means a loss of GDP. So if our companies and businesses aren't making as much money as they used to, then you're going to enter a recession. This means that businesses don't have enough profits and revenue, and eventually they're going to have to start cutting workers. This is a very scary time because Americans aren't making a lot of money. Eventually, businesses are going to have to continue to pay them more, which only contributes to inflation, but they have to do it because everything costs so much right now. To me, inflation is going to continue to go up even next month. Now, we might start to see some things in the consumer price index slow down over the next few months because of all of the things the Federal Reserve is doing to try to lower it. The Federal Reserve is going to get aggressive with inflation. There's no doubt in my mind that during their next meeting, they're going to have a 50 basis point hike, and we're going to see their benchmark interest rates go from around 0% almost to 1% in just the span of a few months. They want to raise interest rates 6 to 7 more times in 2022 and several more times in 2023. So this inflation issue clearly isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Their goal is to try to get inflation back to their target range of around 1 to 3%. But I don't think they're going to be able to achieve that in 2022, mainly because we have so many things going on in our economy right now and across the world that is totally out of the Fed's hands. For instance, we have the Russia-Ukraine war. That has meant that energy costs like oil and natural gas have gone way up over the past few months. That conflict doesn't seem to be ending anytime anytime soon, and the longer it goes on for, the more those things are going to cost. Of course, oil providers in the United States are starting to increase production, but that's going to take a few months, and it's going to lag what costs and prices are going to be throughout the country. So yeah, that alone is going to make sure that prices continue to rise. But not only that, it's really hard to find a place to live right now. Inventory is super low, and if you can afford to buy a house, then great, but not everybody can do that, so they have to turn to something. They have to rent, but it's even difficult to find an apartment right now because costs are going way up. That has led to shelter costs increasing in the United States as well, so that is probably going to continue in 2022 until we start to see extremely low demand in our country. Once we start to see that and inventory can increase in the housing market, then you might start to see an equilibrium. And of course, with the auto market, we have to start making more chips so we can produce a lot more cars. Those microchips are basically the brains of vehicles, and if we can't get them, we can't make a new car. We're starting to up that too, building more factories in the United States and overseas, but again, that's all going to take time, sometimes even years. We don't know how long that's going to last for, so what we can expect next is the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates more aggressively and faster than they've previously said. 2, expect inflation to continue to rise. Markets are going to be volatile because of that, because now businesses are probably going to be losing more money. Their costs are going to get a lot higher because they have to pay people a lot more, and so on. Will it cause an actual recession though? I'm not too convinced. It really just depends on exactly what happens overseas and with the Federal Reserve. If the Fed gets way too aggressive and raises interest rates to say near 20%, well, then that could cause a recession because now nobody can afford to buy anything. I don't think they're going to get that aggressive though. I think they're going to get more aggressive than they've said, but they're not going to do that to our economy, especially since we have an election year coming up in 2023 and 2024. They don't want to be the bad guys. The President of the United States does not want to be the bad guy and cause a recession while he's trying to get reelected. So they're going to play it very easy, which means inflation is going to go up and the price of everything is going to continue to go up in the United States. I think the next CPI report that comes out though is going to be very telling about the future of our economy. If we continue to see core inflation and food numbers and commodity prices decrease in the United States, well, there is a reason for that. Demand is starting to come down, whether it's because people just don't have enough money or it's because of the Federal Reserve. That doesn't really matter as far as our economy is concerned. That means that inflation is coming back down. What you got to remember too is our economy has not been functioning like it should over the last 2 years. It's been hyperinflated. Everything as far as the eye can see has gone up, and now everything needs to come back down. It's really the speed that investors and experts are worried about. If everything comes down very quickly, then that's called a crash and a recession. If everything comes down very slowly, then that's expected, but it also means that suffering is going to continue for Americans' wallets for the foreseeable future. But if things continue to start going down on the next Consumer Price Index report, that means inflation might be finally hitting its peak and the rest of the country can finally start to go back to business as usual, whatever that means. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about the most recent Consumer Price Index report that showed inflation hit a new over 40-year high of around 8.5%? Do you think that inflation is going to continue to go up throughout 2022, or do you think that inflation has finally peaked and we're going to start seeing the price of everything go down in our economy? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with all of the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out updates 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another one ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.